And so the basic idea of this link is interrelatedness, interlockedness, so that death and life, as I said, imply each other. So that you might, speaking from the standpoint of Indian philosophy, of Hinduism, of Buddhism, you might pick an argument with Hamlet and say, to be or not to be is not the question. These are not alternatives. They are things that go together just like up and down, back and front, solid and space. Now there's another aspect to karma which needs to be considered here, and that is that karma also involves the idea of the continuity of pattern. You know, strictly speaking, Buddhists don't believe that there is any soul entity which passes from one life to another. There is no sort of fixed I or fixed ego which once was an animal and then became a man and then became an angel and then eventually became a Buddha or something like that. The idea of karma as the linking factor between the various lives is what we might call continuity of pattern. For example, consider an army regiment. A certain regiment goes on year after year after year. Old European regiments, for example, have existed for hundreds of years. And yet the personnel of those regiments, and even the barracks in which they are stationed, are entirely changed. In the same way, a university. Harvard University has existed for a long time. Oxford for a lot longer. And yet there is not a single member of the faculty, not a single student, who was there when it first began. And yet, you see, the university goes on. Because what goes on is a pattern, a form of life. In the same way, the individual body of man, every 7 years, I think, all the molecules composing our physical structure are entirely changed. And yet, something identifiable as the pattern, which we associate with Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so, is still there. Another fascinating illustration of continuity of pattern in this sense is wave motion. It's perhaps easiest to illustrate with something like a barber's pole. When you twirl it. Now, as you twirl it, there's an illusion of something moving upwards from the bottom to the top of the pole. It seems that the strips go along. Now, actually, they don't go along. They just go round. And in the same way, also, when waves move across water, there's no water moving across. There is the wave pattern moving across. The water is just going up and down, as you can tell when you see, say, a dead leaf floating on the water's surface, and it isn't moved along by the waves. So this idea of continuity of pattern is the solution which Indian philosophy offers on the matter of the problem of death. The individual, as it were, entity is constantly changing. He does not go on, but the pattern or the karma, the pattern of action, goes on. And it's all embraced by that figure you saw of the great demon of impermanence. Could we look at that demon once again? I want to say something more about him. From our Western ideas, this fellow looks pretty evil. And we might associate him with the devil in the Hebrew or Christian sense of a principle of evil. In Buddhism, demons are not evil. They are really beneficent. They have a frightening aspect, but underneath this, there is a deeper meaning. This demon represents change or impermanence. But the deep insight underlying this is that change is a liberating factor. Death is a liberating factor. Did it not exist, life would not exist either. And therefore the wise man is not afraid of the demon. He goes, as it were, straight forward to him to embrace him. And at that moment the demon is transformed. And so in the same way, in a deeper sense, Buddhists do not think of these various realms of the wheel as literal worlds where there are angels and demons and starved ghosts, but they represent the various phases of consciousness. Equanimity, general kind of medium consciousness, quiet consciousness is the human state. The angel state is supreme happiness. The animal state is animality. Here is misery in its extreme, and here is frustration in its extreme. But the fundamental idea of the whole wheel that we have to remember, the idea of karma, is the interlocking, the interdependence of being and not being, of death and life, and the fact that the demon of change is really a disguise of the very source of life. The death without which life is impossible, the change without which life is totally boring. Now, of course, when any idea like that is explained, the first thing that we ask is it true? Is there a process of rebirth? Do our patterns go on and have influence to an illimitable future? But you know, as this idea is held by deeply thoughtful Hindus and Buddhists, it isn't a belief in something which we can't prove. It's really quite a self-evident notion. Think of it in this way. Supposing I make two statements. Statement one: after I die, I shall be reborn again as a baby, but I shall forget my former life. Statement two: after I die, a baby will be born. Now, I believe that those two statements are saying exactly the same thing. And we know that the second one is true. Babies are always being born. Conscious beings of all kinds are constantly coming into existence after others die. But why would I think that the two statements are really the same statement? Because after all, if you die and your memory comes to an end, and you forget who you were, being reborn again is exactly the equivalent of somebody else being born, because we have no consciousness of our continuity unless we have memory. If the memory goes, then we might just as well be somebody else. But it seems to me that the fascinating thing about this is that although a particular set of memories vanishes, death is not the end of consciousness. In other words, we are deluded by a kind of fantasy if we think of death as endless darkness. Endless nothingness is not only inconceivable, but it's logically absolutely meaningless, because we aren't able to have any idea, much less sensation of nothing, unless it can be compared with a sensation of something. These two things go together. And therefore, I think what is meant is that the vacuum created by the disappearance of a being, by the disappearance of his memory system, is simply filled by another being who is I, just as you feel you're I. The funny thing, though, about being I, about feeling that one is sort of a center of the universe, is that you can only experience this I sensation in the singular. You can't experience being two or three I's all at the same time. Now then, it seems to me that this idea has three very important consequences. One is that the disappearance of our memory in death is not really something to be regretted. Of course, everybody wishes to hold forever to the memories and to the people and the situations that he particularly loves. But surely if we think this through, is that what we actually want? Do we really want to have those we love, however greatly we love them, for always and always and always and always? Isn't it inconceivable that even in a very distant future, we wouldn't get tired of it? And this indeed is the secret of the thing. This is why the demon of impermanence is beneficent. Because it is forgetting about things that renews their wonder. Just think, when you opened your eyes on the world for the first time as a child, how brilliant colors were. What a jewel the sun was. What marvels the stars. How incredibly alive the trees were. That's all because they were new to your eyes. Or in the same way, you know how it is, you've been reading a mystery story. And you're looking around the house, you want something to read, and you pick up an old mystery story. If you read it years and years ago and you've forgotten all about the plot, it still excites you. But if you remember the plot, it doesn't excite you. And so, by the dispensation of forgetting, the world is constantly renewed. And we are able to see it again and again, and to love again and again, to have people to whom we are deeply attached and deeply fond, always with renewed intensity, and without the contrast of having seen them before, for always and always and always. Another consequence of this is a very curious realization to me. Remember that question, who would I be if my mother had married someone else? Who, if I were you, we often say, one might so easily have been you. I might so easily have been born in China and India. Why do I feel that the world is centered in this place, as distinct from some other place? You jolly well know the world is centered where you are. And this gives one a very strange feeling of the idea that other people jolly well exist in the same sense you do. Everybody's name is I. That's what you call yourself. So there will always be I's in the world. Every I is in a way the same I. We all might be anyone else. And there is no escape. It goes on and on and on and on. So long as there is consciousness anywhere, there is I. You then, in a way, look out through all eyes. And that, perhaps, is the secret of the great virtue of compassion.